Nadine Crandall was 68 years old when her eldest son folded his father's will in half, tossed it onto the table, and said the old man must have lost his mind at the end. She was sitting on the other side of the conference table in the attorney's office in Middlebury, Vermont, with her hands clasped together in her lap, fingers interlaced the way she always did when she needed to hold herself still. It was a Tuesday morning in late May. The maple trees outside the window were bright green with new leaves, and the air smelled the way Vermont always smells in late spring, like rain that just stopped and earth that is starting to warm. 40 years taking care of that family. 40 years waking before the sun so the coffee would be ready when Boyd left to milk the cows. 40 years of holding hands through winters that could freeze the water in your boots if you stood still too long, of the smell of rennet and fresh milk soaked into the walls of their house until it became the smell of the house itself. And there sat the son. She had nursed the boy, who had learned to walk by gripping her index finger, who had cried in her lap through every heartbreak of his growing up. There he sat, treating the last words of his father like a candy wrapper, crumpled and tossed. "The creamery goes to us," Vance said to his siblings without looking at his mother. "The house goes to us. The truck goes to us. And Mom gets this." He pointed at a line near the bottom of the document. One line, one handwritten line where a share of the estate should have been. Grady Munn, the accountant who had managed Boyd's books for 20 years, sat at the far end of the table with a thin beard and a way of speaking that avoided eye contact, as if the floor held something more interesting than the people above it. He had spent 45 minutes explaining the numbers. Dinah had listened to every word, understood every word, and asked no questions because the math added up and she knew how to add. The creamery, the main business with its equipment, its current inventory, the registered brand name, the distribution contracts across 3 counties, and the aging room full of cheese in process was valued at roughly $120,000. The property where the house and creamery sat, 12 acres with fencing, an artesian well, and all improvements, was valued at approximately $85,000. The Ford F-150 2018 model in good condition was worth about $55,000. There was a checking account with $19,000 and a certificate of deposit worth $26,000 maturing in December. Total estate value approximately $305,000. The will, drafted by an attorney in Middlebury in 2019, signed by 2 witnesses and notarized, divided the estate as follows. The creamery, the property, and the truck went to the 3 children in equal shares to be decided among themselves by mutual agreement. The bank accounts were split evenly 3 ways. For Nadine Crandall, there was the statutory right of use of the home as surviving spouse. And there was one sentence written in Boyd's hand in the final paragraph of the document, in a script that was wee and slightly tilted and trembled at the edges the way handwriting does when the hand that holds the pen is no longer entirely steady. "Go to the end of Old Falls Road and open the blue gate." Dina read that sentence over and over, while her children signed documents and initialed pages and asked Grady about tax implications. She read it while Jolene, the middle child, leaned over and quietly suggested that Dina write down the number of a lawyer she knew just in case Mom needed help applying for some kind of assistance. She read it while Colby, the youngest, stared at his hands and said nothing. She read it while Vance was already on his phone texting a real estate contact about getting the house appraised. What none of them knew, what none of these 3 children, raised on the money earned by Boyd and Dina Crandall's calloused hands, could have imagined, was that behind that blue gate at the end of a dirt road in the hills of Vermont was the answer to every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every time Boyd came home late with mud on his boots and a smile she could never quite explain. Behind that blue gate was the finest aged cheese that region had ever produced. Behind it was a contract with a French importer that the children never once suspected existed. Behind it were 80 acres of high-altitude pasture with 35 purebred Holstein cows, the best in the county, maintained in secret by a caretaker Boyd had been paying for 15 years, with money that never appeared in any bank statement the children could find. And behind it was a letter that began, Dina. If you are reading this, it means the thing I always knew would happen has happened, and the thing you never wanted to believe would happen has happened too, because you were always more generous with them than they deserved. But that is later. To understand what Dina found behind the blue gate, and to understand why it broke her open, and then put her back together in a shape she had not been in for 40 years, you have to know who she was before. You have to go back to the beginning. Nadine Ferris was born on a Friday in August of 1956 on a small farm in the hills of central Vermont in a stretch of the Green Mountains that did not yet have the pretty names that tourism would later give it. It was just the mountains. High and cold in the mornings, warm in the afternoons, with green pasture that looked painted on, and a silence so deep that people from the cities found it oppressive. Dana always thought it was the most beautiful sound there was. Her father, Harlan Ferris, was a retired long-haul trucker who had bought a piece of land with the savings of a lifetime of work. It was not large, and it was not wealthy land, but it was his, and he tended it the way some men tend churches. Her mother, Idelle, was the daughter of a cheesemaker from the next valley, over a woman who had learned as a child that good cheese cannot be rushed, and who had passed that teaching down to every one of her children, starting with Dina, the eldest of 6. The house where Dina grew up had walls of rough plaster and packed earth floors in the back bedrooms, but the living room had an oak floor that her father had laid with his own hands, plank by plank, over 2 weekends with 3 neighbors helping. She remembered the smell of wet mortar mixed with the coffee her mother brewed in a cloth filter and served every hour to the men who worked. That smell, mortar and coffee, was to Dina the smell of dignity, of something built with sweat and with witnesses. Idelle said it with the blunt honesty that only a rural mother has the nerve to deliver. Dina was not the prettiest of Harlan Ferris's daughters, but she was the steadiest. She had a way of looking at things, at cheese on a shelf, at cattle in a field, at a problem that needed solving, that made the people around her feel that everything was under control. As if the world could collapse and Nadine Ferris would still be standing there, assessing the damage with those dark brown eyes, very calm, already thinking about what to do next. Physically, she was the kind of woman who gets more beautiful with time rather than less, as if life were slowly sculpting the best of her. Short with broad shoulders from a lifetime of carrying weight and hands that were her signature, large for a woman her size, with knuckles slightly swollen from decades of work in the cold, but always clean. Always cared for with a lanolin cream, she applied every single night before bed without exception. Her hair started going gray around 50, and she never colored it, never considered it. White hair is lived hair, she would say, and anyone who knew her understood there was no vanity in it. It was the same frank objectivity with which she evaluated everything. The rosary was the habit everyone in town recognized. Dina had carried a wooden bead rosary in the pocket of her apron since she was 16, a confirmation gift from her godmother. When she was thinking deeply about something, her hand would go to the pocket automatically, and her fingers would begin moving over the beads without her noticing. Her children grew up seeing it. The neighbors knew the gesture from a distance. When Dina's hand disappeared into her pocket, it was best not to interrupt. She learned to make cheese before she learned to read. That was the way of the families in these hills. Cheese came first because cheese paid for the notebook and the pencil. By 7, she could adjust salt by feel alone, knowing how the crystals should dissolve against the curd between her fingertips. By 10, she could distinguish morning milk from evening milk by smell, and she understood that mixing the two produced a different result than using each in its own time. The morning milk carried a lighter fat, more volatile, better for texture. The evening milk was richer, denser, better for depth. These were not things she read in any book. They were things her hands and her nose had taught her, the way a musician learns intervals, not from theory, but from the sound itself. Boyd Crandall came into her life at a 4th of July dance in 1974 when Dina was 18 and he was 20. He was not from their town. He had come from New Hampshire to work on one of the larger dairy farms in the region, and he showed up at the dance wearing a straw hat at a crooked angle and a smile that seemed to be apologizing for its own existence. A shy smile on a wide and honest face, the face of a man who had grown tall too fast and still did not know what to do with his own size. He was tall, with shoulders that curved inward as though he were trying to reduce his height, and hands that were always slightly busy, always holding something, a cup, a stick, a key ring, because empty hands made him uncomfortable. They danced. She had not wanted to dance at first. She thought it was the kind of fast group dancing she was not good at. But he insisted in a way that was not really insistence. It was closer to a plea for help. "I dance worse than my father," he said, "and he has got arthritis in both knees. If you come along, at least we fall together." She laughed, and when she laughed, something in Boyd's face relaxed, as if he had been waiting for exactly that laugh from exactly that person. They courted for 2 years. 2 years of visits every Sunday, of walking the dirt road between the two properties, of conversations that began with the weather and the cattle and ended hours later in places neither of them could name, but that felt right. Boyd was not a man of many words. He was a man of few complaints and much action, the type who fixes the fence before you ask and shows up with the right tool before you realize you need it. Dina appreciated this. She used words when necessary, and Boyd's silence was a good silence, the kind that did not need to be filled. They married in June of 1976 at the small white church on the green in Middlebury, with 70 guests and a dress Dinah's mother sewed in 3 weeks. The dress was simple. White cotton lace at the wrists, no train, no long veil, because Dina had told her mother she would not spend money they did not have on something worn once. Idelle had cried a little about that. Then she had sewn the finest lace her tired eyes could manage. And on the wedding day, she had straightened her daughter's collar with both hands and said only this: "Go be happy, Dina girl." Dina had answered that she would try, and she tried. For 40 years straight, she tried with a steadiness that most people reserve for things much easier than a marriage and a farm and 3 children and a creamery in the hills of Vermont. The first years were spent in the addition that Boyd's father had built onto the back of his property in New Hampshire. It was not much: 2 rooms, a makeshift bathroom, 1 window that whistled in the wind. But it was theirs, and they worked to turn it into a home with the same quiet determination they brought to everything. Dina sewed curtains from calico fabric. Boyd built a shelf from oak that stood in their kitchen for the next 40 years and survived 3 house moves. They bought a second-hand bed and a wardrobe with a cracked mirror that Boyd covered with floral contact paper because Dina did not like seeing herself fractured every morning. Boyd started making cheese from the beginning. He had no capital to buy land of his own, so he leased pasture from a bigger farmer, kept 6 cows, and sold the cheese at the farmer's market in town. It was modest, but it was honest, and Dina knew enough about cheese to see what needed improving. Their first disagreements, if you could even call them that, were about salt levels and aging times. Boyd thought she used too much salt. She thought he was impatient with the aging. Slowly, each gave ground and the cheese they made together became good, then very good, then the best at the market. Boyd developed his own aging method. He called it, without false modesty, the patience method. It meant exactly what the name suggested. Most cheesemakers in the region sold their cheese fresh or aged 30 days at most. Boyd aged for 60, for 90, for 120 days, depending on the season and the humidity. The aging room was a small chamber behind the creamery where he had installed shelves made of cedar, which did not mold and did not transfer flavor to the cheese. He turned each wheel by hand 3 times a week, and he talked to them. Dina caught him doing this once and asked what he was doing. Talking, he said without irony. Cheese that listens ages better. She shook her head. But she never asked again because the truth was his cheese did age better. Vance was born in 1978, Jolene in 1981, Colby the youngest in 1984. Each birth was a recalibration of everything. More mouths, less sleep, more need for money, more reason to work. Boyd expanded the herd. Dina expanded production. They woke at 4 every morning, Boyd to milk and Dina to process, and they worked side by side until the afternoon sun made the work bearable. What Dina sacrificed in those years was never listed, never counted, never acknowledged, because she herself never understood it as sacrifice. It was simply the life she had chosen. But if someone were to make a list, the list would be long. There was the nursing program she had wanted to take in 1979. When the state opened a training course in the next town, she had set aside the registration fee. She had spoken with the teacher who recommended her. She had written her name on the application. Then Vance got pneumonia and spent 20 days in the hospital. The registration money became medicine money. And when the crisis passed, so had the deadline. She never brought it up again. She kept the application in a brown envelope for a few years. Then she threw it out without ceremony. There were the Christmases without presents because the money had gone to vaccinate the herd. There were the nights alone with 3 small children because Boyd had driven to a distant market and the roads were too bad to return after dark. There were the clothes she sewed from older siblings' garments for the younger ones, the dresses she mended instead of replaced the smaller portion of meat she served herself while claiming she preferred that cut. And there were the things she did for her children as they grew, things the children seemed to have forgotten completely. Vance, the eldest, was always the most difficult. Intelligent, everyone recognized that, Dina included, and she was proud of him with a consistency that sometimes resembled stubbornness. But he had a restlessness with the world that he never outgrew. When he was 15 and wanted to go to Boston to study, it was Dina who convinced Boyd to let him go. It was Dina who sewed a new backpack from canvas. It was Dina who stayed up until 2 in the morning the night before his departure, baking the cookies he liked so he could take them on the bus. When he came back 2 years later because the city had not suited him, it was Dina who did not say, "I told you so." She just opened the door and said, "Go heat up the beans." But when Vance came back, he brought something with him that had not been there before. A way of looking at his parents that Dina recognized but did not yet name. It was the look of someone evaluating people who have not kept up with the times. One evening, Vance said to Jolene in the kitchen, thinking Dina was out of earshot, "All they have ever known is cheese." Dina heard it. She did not respond, but she remembered. Jolene, the middle child, was easier day to day, but had a specific talent for appearing at the worst possible moments with a need for money. Her car broke down the same month the creamery ran at a loss. The apartment she wanted to rent in Burlington came up exactly when the roof needed repairs. Dina always found a way. There was always a little money tucked away in the bottom of a tin that appeared on no bank statement. There was always a favor that could be called in. There was always a solution that cost a little more work and a little more silence than necessary. Colby, the youngest, was the favorite, and Dina knew it and was ashamed of knowing it because a mother should not have favorites. But Colby had Boyd's eyes and Boyd's gentle way and the same ability to appear in the kitchen at the right moment and sit beside his mother without saying anything, just being there. When Colby went to college for business administration, the only one of the three children whose tuition was paid in full by the parents from start to finish with no scholarship and no loan, Dina had told Boyd it was the most important investment they would ever make. "That boy will take care of us when we are old," she had said. Boyd had agreed in silence. He had not said anything more, just nodded with a slightly distant look that Dina had attributed to tiredness at the time. The first time Tamsin Vance's wife visited the farm, she walked through the house with eyes that Dina read instantly, evaluating, categorizing, ranking. Tamsin paused at the kitchen doorway and said with the brightness of a suggestion, "Have you ever thought about updating?" "Everything here works," Dina replied. Her voice was neutral, but the silent war between the two women began with that sentence and never truly ended. As the years passed and the children left home, Vance to Burlington, Jolene to Boston, Colby to Rutland, the house grew quieter in a way Dina learned to love. She and Boyd were good in each other's company, and the silence the children left behind was not emptiness. It was space. Space for him to work without interruption in the creamery while she tended the garden. Space for the two of them to eat dinner without competing with the television the children always turned on the moment they sat down. Space for low-volume conversations about small things, the weather, the cattle, the shelf in the aging room that was bowing, the new biscuit recipe the neighbor shared. They were happy. It needs to be said clearly, because the things that come after can sometimes obscure what came before, and what came before was real. Two old people who knew each other so well they sometimes finished each other's sentences without realizing it, who had slept on the same side of the bed for 40 years and still felt uncomfortable when the other traveled, who drank coffee together on the porch every morning before work began, with the mountain mist still low over the pasture and the cold nipping at their ears, and who did not need to say a single word during those coffees because the company was enough. The happy moments were specific and engraved in her with a precision that time could not erode. Christmas of 1992 was the one she remembered most clearly, the year things had finally worked out well enough for real presents under the tree and a full dinner on the table, and all three children still home, still young enough to wake early and run to the living room. Boyd had bought a disposable camera and taken photographs of everything. Dina still had those photos in a shoebox in the bedroom closet. Her in the apron serving the ham, her hair still dark, her eyes shining in a way she herself never noticed. But that showed up in every picture. And there was the trip to Lake Champlain they took in 1998 when Colby was finishing high school and the other two had already left home. 3 days in a cabin by the water. Boyd had fished the entire first day without catching anything and had returned with the expression of a man who had been personally offended by the fish. She had laughed so hard she had to sit down on a bench near the shore to recover. During those 3 nights without children, without the creamery, without any obligation other than waking up and seeing the water, Dina had remembered who they were before everything else. And she had liked very much what she remembered. They were happy. That is what makes everything that follows harder, more unjust, and more extraordinary all at once. Sometime around 2003 or 2004, Dana could never pin down the exact year Boyd began to disappear periodically. He did not truly disappear. He always told her in advance, Always said he had some things to sort out over toward Old Falls or out past Pleasant Valley. Always came back on the day he promised, but he came back different. Slightly lighter, like a man who had just set down a weight he had been carrying. And there was a faint smell on his clothes when he returned milk and rennet, but different from the smell of their own creamery. A different batch, a different room. She asked him once directly in 2007, "Boyd, what is it you go sort out every time you take that road?" He paused. A 2-second pause she had learned to recognize as the time he needed to decide how much to say. Some cattle business. Nothing you need to worry about. She looked at him for a moment. There were things in Boyd's expression that she read the way she read a familiar book. But there was a quality beneath the omission, a honesty underneath the withholding that told her whatever it was not something that would hurt her. So she accepted it, not blindly. She simply chose to trust what she could read in him over what he was not saying. The trips continued once a month for 15 years. 15 years of Boyd leaving and coming back lighter. 15 years of a different smell on his clothes. 15 years of a small black notebook he kept in the drawer of his desk in the back office of the house, a drawer that was always locked. Dina noticed she never mentioned it. There were certain intimacies in a marriage that were respected in silence, and the locked drawer was one of them. The office itself was a small room at the back of the house that Boyd had claimed as his workspace. A wooden desk and old chairs, shelves of files and veterinary manuals and farming magazines with pages folded down. He locked it from outside with a padlock when he left, not always, but when there were documents on the desk. Dina had asked once if she could go in and clean, and he had said he cleaned it himself. And he did in his way, which was functional cleaning, no dust, no clutter, but without the aligned frames and pushed-in chairs that Dina's presence would have guaranteed. She let it be. It was Boyd's space, and she understood space. Every person needs a place that belongs only to them. She never imagined what was kept inside. Boyd Crandall died on a Tuesday in May of 2024 at 4 in the morning of a massive heart attack. He had gone to bed as normal. He had said goodnight with a usual squeeze of her arm, except that the squeeze lasted 30 seconds longer than it usually did. Dina noticed. She did not comment. She would only understand the weight of those 30 seconds later. The doctor at the emergency room said it was fast, no suffering. She sat beside his bed for 40 minutes with her hand on his face, unable to understand how something so enormous could happen so quietly. She did not know yet that Boyd had spent the last 15 years preparing for exactly this moment. She did not know what was waiting for her at the end of Old Falls Road. She did not know that the tall man with the curved shoulders and the shy smile had spent more than a decade building brick by brick, wheel by wheel, a love letter the size of an entire farm. Boyd was buried on a Saturday afternoon in the town cemetery at the edge of Middlebury, under a May sky that was too blue and too calm for what was happening beneath it. Father Dwyer, a young man who was new to the parish and still learning the customs of the place, said kind words that were also generic words, the kind that proved the minister did not know the man being buried. Dina stood beside the open grave for the entire ceremony with her hands in the pockets of her black coat, and she thought that she would need to tell Father Dwyer to spend more time getting to know people before he spoke about them at their funerals. The house filled the way it had not filled since the early 90s. Neighbors, old business partners of Boyd's suppliers of rennet and salt cheese buyers who drove in from 3 different counties. Miss Oakes, the retired school teacher, 80 years old, and leaning on a cane, who had lived in town her whole life and came to say goodbye to a former student. And the children, of course. All 3 arrived on the day of the viewing with their families, their cars, their suitcases that suggested a stay longer than a funeral required. Vance came with Tamsin and their teenage son Keegan, who spent the entire time in a corner of the living room with his phone in his hand. Vance had gained weight since his last visit the Christmas 2 years before, and he moved through the rooms with his thumbs hooked in his belt, looking at things. Not looking the way a grieving son looks. Looking the way a man looks at property he is mentally appraising. Dina saw it. She did not name it because it was the day of the funeral, and she did not have the energy to name things that would make her angry. Jolene arrived alone. She had divorced her husband 2 years earlier and had not dated since, a fact she had mentioned on the phone several times, with a specific kind of drama that Dina listened to patiently, but without much commentary. Jolene cried throughout the viewing. She cried in a way Dina recognized as genuine because Jolene had always been a woman of oversized but real feelings, and she had loved her father in her own inconsistent and loud way. She held on to her mother for a long time beside the casket, and in that embrace there was something true that Dina would need to remember later in the months ahead, when Jolene would become a different person. Colby arrived last with his new girlfriend, Willa, a young woman who was visibly uncomfortable, as if she did not know where to rest her eyes in a house full of death. Colby hugged his mother for a long time without speaking, and Dina felt in that hug the boy with Boyd's eyes she had raised. On the drive back from the cemetery, the children were already talking about the will. Not directly, not yet, but there were side conversations that Dina overheard from the kitchen while she served coffee to the neighbors who had attended the burial. Vance asking Tamsin in a low voice whether the attorney's office would be open Monday. Jolene asking Colby if he knew the status of the Creamery's accounts. Colby answering in an even lower voice that he had spoken with the accountant and everything was well documented. These were conversations not meant for Dina's ears, or perhaps they were, and her intelligence was being underestimated, which happened with the frequency she had observed over the years, without ever addressing directly. What followed the funeral was a long and quiet demolition. It was not that the children were openly cruel. They were cruel in the worst possible way, which is the functional way. Every action had a logic, a reason, a practical argument that made it difficult to point a finger and say, "This is wrong." It was just the estate being managed, just decisions that needed to be made. On Wednesday, 4 days after Boyd had been put in the ground, 4 days, Vance brought a real estate appraiser to the house. The man walked through Dina's home with a tape measure and a tablet noting dimensions. The kitchen, 6x4. The bedroom, 4x4. The living room with the leather couch Boyd had chosen with the eager look of a boy wanting a gift, 5x6. Dinah sat on the porch and listened to the sound of a stranger's footsteps measuring the rooms where she had lived her entire adult life. On Thursday, Jolene asked to enter Boyd's office to check for business documents. Dina said the office was locked and she did not know where the key was. This was the truth. She had looked in Boyd's drawers and not found it. On Friday, without anyone informing Dina, 2 men arrived in a truck to conduct an inventory of the Creamery stock. They were employees of a distributor in Burlington sent by Vance. Dina stopped them at the door. "Nobody enters this Creamery without my knowing." Vance called 30 minutes later, his voice heavy with exaggerated patience. Dina hung up. On Saturday morning, Tamsin walked into the kitchen while Dina was making bread and began opening drawers. Not timidly, not asking permission, opening them with the familiarity of someone who has already decided this is her house. "Just checking what is in here," Tamsin said with a smile that stopped below her eyes. "For when the renovation starts, so we know what to keep." Dina placed both flour-covered hands on the edge of the sink. She did not speak. She stood exactly like that, looking at Tamsin until Tamsin closed the drawer and left the kitchen without a word. On Monday of the following week, 10 days after Boyd had been buried, 10 days, Vance arrived with a lawyer. Not the attorney who had drafted Boyd's will, a new one. Leland Trask from Burlington with a leather briefcase and the manner of a man accustomed to talking over other people. Trask explained in a professionally neutral voice that to facilitate the transition of the estate inventory, it would be ideal for the residential portion of the property to be vacated within 30 days so that renovations could begin without legal complications. The word vacate was spoken in a normal voice, as if it were an ordinary word, as if it were not being applied to the house where Nadine Crandall had lived for 32 years. Dina, sitting in her usual chair at the head of the dining table, heard this and thought that there was a great deal happening at a speed that felt wrong for a woman who had buried her husband 10 days ago. 30 days, she repeated. That is the reasonable timeline for you to organize your belongings, Trask said, making reasonable sound like a word that should be slapped. I need more than 30 days. How much time do you need? Trask asked, as if he were holding a pen ready to write down the answer. I need however long it takes to get to the end of Old Falls Road. Vance let out a short breath through his nose. Mom, we have talked about this. I know what you said, and I am telling you what I am going to do. After the meeting ended and Trask was packing his briefcase, Dina heard his voice from the hallway speaking quietly to Vance in the tone of a man who assumes walls are thicker than they are. If she does not cooperate, we can file for partition. The court will order a sale. Dina heard every word. She understood. They were not merely asking her to leave. They were prepared to use the courts to take the house from under her. Colby found her in the kitchen an hour later. He spoke softly, looking at the table. Mom, we are not going to leave you with nothing. We want to find a solution that is good for everyone. But you will need to decide about the house soon, whether you stay here while we manage the estate with the restrictions that would involve, or whether we find you somewhere better. Better for whom? Dina asked. Neither of them answered. Dina began packing on Wednesday, not because she had surrendered to the 30-day deadline, but because she had realized during those 2 weeks that staying in the house while her children measured its walls with their eyes and planned renovations behind her back was worse than whatever uncertainty might be waiting at the end of a dirt road. The house had stopped being hers the moment Vance brought in the man with the tape measure. Sleeping there now was sleeping in a place that had already changed owners in practice, even if the papers were not yet signed. She packed with care and with criteria. She took only what fit in the trunk in the back seat of the car. The car was a silver 2009 Chevy Malibu that had been Boyd's and that passed to her because it was the only asset not listed in the main estate inventory. It had been registered in her name 5 years ago, one of Boyd's quiet arrangements that she now, looking back, understood differently. Clothes, 2 winter coats, 3 work outfits, 2 Sunday dresses, documents. Her ID marriage certificate, Boyd's death certificate, and a notarized copy of the original will that she had requested from Boyd's attorney without telling the children. The shoebox of photographs, Christmas 1992, the trip to Lake Champlain, Colby's graduation, the wedding photo yellowing at the edges, the rosary already in her pocket, the lanolin cream, her Sunday missal, a small pot and a good knife because she did not know what she would find on the other side of the blue gate, and she wanted to arrive ready to cook. And the envelope. The envelope had appeared in the last drawer she emptied before closing up the bedroom. A small drawer in the nightstand on Boyd's side, which she had opened, expecting to find the usual things. Peppermints, an old pocket knife, the wristwatch he no longer wore, but would not throw away. And underneath everything, a brown envelope with her name written by hand. Nadine. Boyd's handwriting. The script of a man who had learned to write late and had never become fully comfortable with a pen. Wide and leaning with the letters spaced apart, as if each one needed room to breathe. She stood holding the envelope for a long time. Then she put it in the pocket of her apron beside the rosary without opening it. There were things that needed to be opened in the right place. The last dinner in the house was eaten alone. Rice beans, a slice of cheese from the refrigerator. She ate in the kitchen in her usual seat, looking through the window at the dark yard where the rosebush had not seen its owner in a week. Boyd's chair across from her was empty. It had been empty before on nights he traveled, on days he left early and returned late. But there was a different quality to the emptiness now, a permanence that Dina recognized as the working definition of widowhood. She washed the dishes, dried them, put them away, turned off the kitchen light, walked down the hallway, eyes passing over the frames on the wall, the picture of the Virgin Mary she had hung the year they moved in, the landscape calendar she had forgotten to tear past January, the small frame with the wedding photo. She removed the wedding photo from its frame, folded it carefully, and placed it in the apron pocket with the rosary in the envelope. She made the bed. She slept. Thursday morning, 6 o'clock, the fog still on the pasture. She loaded the car without asking for help. Walked through the house one last time, not with sentimentality, but with the attention of someone who wants to remember each thing in its proper place. The kitchen with the smell of the last coffee she had brewed there. The garden with the begonias and the rose bush that would be left behind. The living room with the leather couch that Tamsin had already mentioned replacing with something more modern in Dina's presence, as if Donna were not in the same room. She locked the front door, left the key under the azalea pot where the children knew it was kept, and drove away without saying goodbye to anyone because there was no one to say goodbye to, and because she had realized in those 2 weeks that the goodbye that mattered had already been said on a May afternoon before Boyd fell asleep for the last time. She did not drive to Old Falls Road. She drove to the parking area near the reservoir at the edge of town, a spot where she and Boyd used to sit and eat lunch on market days. She turned off the engine. She sat. The sky began to darken. She did not start the car. This was the moment she came closest to breaking. Not because she cried, she did not cry, but because for the first time in 68 years, Nadine Ferris Crandall did not know what the next step was. She had always known. When Vance had pneumonia, she knew what to do. When the money ran out, she knew. When Boyd died, she knew. Bury him, sign the papers, make coffee for the guests, but now sitting in a silver car with everything she owned, piled in the back seat with an unopened envelope in her pocket, and a single handwritten line pointing her toward the end of a dirt road she did not know. She sat in the car until it was fully dark. Then the moon rose over the reservoir. She watched the light on the water and thought of Boyd, the way he always fixed the fence before anyone asked, the way he always knew what the next step was. And she thought he left that line not because he was confused. He left it because he knew with absolute certainty that she would follow it, because he knew who she was. She started the car, drove to a small roadside motel, slept one night. The next morning, she drove to Old Falls Road. The road began 3 miles past the center of town at a fork that most drivers ignored because there was no new sign. There was an old wooden sign faded that read Old Falls 7 miles with an arrow pointing toward a red dirt track that narrowed between 2 lines of fence. Dina knew this road. She had driven parts of it over the years visiting a neighbor's farm that had been sold back in 2015. But she had never gone to the end. She had never had reason to go to the end. At the 5th mile, the road curved sharply to the right around a hill, and when the car came out of the curve, Dina saw for the first time the valley hidden behind it. A wide valley shaped like a bowl with dark green highland pasture gleaming in the sun, and a small tributary of the creek cutting through the middle, visible only by the row of birch trees growing along its banks. And there at the end of the road where the dirt track ended, on a pad of packed gravel, was a blue gate. It was not the faded blue she had expected. It was real blue, recently painted metal, with iron hinges and a new padlock that caught the morning sun. On both sides of the gate, wire fencing with treated wooden posts stretched in both directions until it disappeared into the grass. Behind the gate, an internal dirt road, well-maintained, climbed toward buildings she could not see completely from this distance. But she could see roof lines, more than one. She stopped the car, looked through the windshield, then she got out, walked to the gate, and found the padlock closed. She went back to the car, opened the glove box where she had stored the brown envelope with her name, opened the envelope. Inside were two things: a letter folded in three, which she put back because the letter was for reading inside, and a key, a small padlock key, the kind you buy at a hardware store with a paper tag tied to the ring in Boyd's handwriting. Blue Gate. She held the key in her palm. Her other hand found the apron pocket, found the wooden beads, moved across them slowly. Then she walked to the gate and opened it. The gate swung with the sound of a well-oiled hinge, not the rusty groan she had expected, but the smooth, firm motion of a piece that had been maintained. She pushed it open, stepped through, closed it behind her without locking it, and stood on the internal road for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to what was in front of her. The first feeling was disorientation. This was not what she had expected. She had expected without realizing she had expected, because expectation sometimes works below the surface of awareness, an abandoned lot. Perhaps a neglected pasture, an old building Boyd had kept as a family memento or as an investment with good intentions, but forgotten execution. She had prepared herself for a manageable disappointment. She had rehearsed during the miles of dirt roadways to find enough value in whatever this was to justify the 40 years that had brought her here. What was behind the blue gate was not disappointing. What was behind the blue gate was a farm. Not a large farm by the standards of the cattle operations in the Midwest or the dairy farms of Wisconsin. It was a farm of human scale, the scale at which a person can love and know a place completely, where every hill has a name and every fenced section has a history. But it was real, alive, and tended with a consistency that only time and constant attention can produce. To the left of the internal road, highland pasture climbed uphill, enclosed by new 5-wire fence with treated eucalyptus posts that showed recent maintenance. The grass was tall and dark green, the kind that grows on good soil with springs underneath. And in the pasture, scattered with the random distribution that is the natural territory of free grazing cattle, were cows. White with black patches and black with white patches. The unmistakable pattern of the Holstein breed. She counted without moving from where she stood more than 20 in her immediate line of sight. There was a small creek crossing the pasture in the background with the birch trees she had seen from the hilltop, and on this side of the creek a long concrete water trough where 3 cows drank with the absolute calm of animals that are well fed and unafraid. To the right of the road, past 50 feet of native grass, was a building. Dina stared at it for a considerable time. It was new, or relatively new. No more than 10 years old, she estimated by the state of the plaster on the walls and the type of roof tile. Solid masonry, thick walls, cream-colored paint, fading slightly at the joints. A double-pitched roof in ceramic tile windows with iron grills painted dark green. A main door of solid wood with large hinges and a brass plaque beside it that she could not read from this distance. Beside the main building was a smaller structure of exposed block 2-barred windows and a galvanized metal door, clearly functional. Behind it, a metal frame storage building with insulated roofing. And between the buildings and the pasture, a small garden. Not elaborate, just enough for color. Yellow heliconia, an ornamental banana plant, clumps of purple iris along the stone path that led from the road to the buildings. She walked the 50 feet to the main door slowly with the measured steps of someone who wants to see everything without missing anything. The air here was different, more heavily loaded with pasture and with something she recognized before she could name it. A smell that was almost muscle memory that had soaked into her clothes and her hair for decades. Milk and rennet, the smell of a creamery. The brass plaque beside the door said in carefully engraved letters, Crandall Artisan Creamery, established 2009. She stood in front of that plaque for a long time. Then she read it again. Then she ran her finger over the engraved letters. Then she took off her glasses, wiped them on her apron, put them back on, and read it a third time. 2009. 15 years. While she had been waking at 4 in the morning at the old creamery. While she had been making the coffee, turning the wheels on the sitter shelves, waiting for Boyd to come home from his monthly trips with that relieved half smile. Boyd had been here. He had been building this for 15 years. The main door was unlocked. The interior hit her with the most concentrated smell of rennet she had encountered in her life. Layered complex. The fresh, acidic note of milk being processed overlaid by the heavier, deeper note of cheese aging, and beneath everything an earthy mineral quality that came from the thick walls and from the aging room she had not yet seen but could already feel. The entry was a short corridor with smooth concrete flooring and white tile walls halfway up. On the right, a coat rack with clean aprons hanging. 2 white cloth aprons, 1 green rubber, 1 a pair of rubber boots on a floor rack. On the left, a shelf with cleaning products, all open, all in use. This was the entry of a creamery that was operating. Not abandoned, not idle for weeks. Someone was working here. The corridor opened into the main processing room. It was large, bigger than the creamery the children had inherited. Roughly 400 square feet, she estimated, with high ceilings and barred windows on both sides, bringing in abundant natural light. A long stainless steel industrial bench ran down the center. Along the walls, stainless steel coagulation vats, 4 of them larger than the ones at the old creamery, a pneumatic cheese press, a whey centrifuge, an array of tools hung on wall-mounted racks, knives cutting wires of various gauges, stainless steel ladles. Everything clean, everything organized, everything as if someone had finished the morning's work and would return in the afternoon. To the right of the main room, a wooden door led to a small office. To the left, a heavier door with rubber weather seal around the edge. Donna opened it and felt the cold. The aging room. Roughly 200 square feet, built with thermal insulation in the walls and ceiling. With controlled temperature, she felt immediately as a dry, clean cold different from the mountain cold outside. Intentional cold. Stable cold. Cedar shelves on all 4 walls, floor to ceiling. And on the shelves, rows of cheese. She counted, slowly shelf by shelf, 417 wheels when she finished counting every shelf. Each piece had a small tag tied with twine, a number, a date, and beside them in Boyd's handwriting, the word Crandall. She left the aging room and went to the office. She recognized it before she understood it. The desk was different, newer, but the chair was the same old chair that had disappeared from the office at home about 3 years ago when Boyd had said he gave it to a neighbor. The black notebook lay open on the desk at the last page of entries. The shelves held labeled files, invoices 2023, active import contract, veterinary records, caretaker payments, and there were photographs, not framed, pinned directly to the wall with thumbtacks as if Boyd had put them there for himself and not for anyone else to see. Photographs of Dina, not formal photographs. Everyday photographs, some clearly taken without her knowledge. Dina in the garden seen from behind watering the begonias. Dina in the kitchen in profile focused on something at the sink. Dina and Boyd on the porch at sunset, a winter Sunday she placed at about 5 years ago. And one more. Dinah asleep in the living room chair, her mouth slightly open, a blanket over her shoulders. She remembered that afternoon. She had fallen asleep after an exhausting production day and woken up with a blanket she had assumed she had pulled over herself in her sleep. She had not pulled it over herself. The envelope on the desk was different from the brown one that had been in the nightstand drawer. This was heavy paper ivory colored with her name written on the front in the blue ink pen Boyd used for contracts. Not his everyday handwriting, his document handwriting. More careful, more deliberate. For Nadine, my wife, she pulled the old chair out, sat down, placed her hands on the envelope for a moment. Then she opened it. Dinah, if you are reading this, it means the thing I always knew would happen has happened, and the thing you never wanted to believe would happen has happened too, because you were always more generous with them than they deserved. I am not saying this out of anger. I am saying it because it is true. And you know me well enough to know I do not say things I do not believe. Let me start with the most important thing. I love you. That sentence has never appeared in any letter I have written in my life because I have never been a letter-writing man, and you know that. But I need it to be on paper because we do not know what time does to the things we only say out loud. And what I feel for you is something that deserves paper. Now let me explain everything. I started building this place in 2009. You will ask, why 2009? The answer is that 2009 was the year Vance asked us to lend him money for the third time in 2 years. $25,000, which was half of what we had at the time. And when I asked what it was for, he said it was for a business. And when I asked which business, he said, I did not need to know, and I gave it to him. You remember, we gave it because they were our children, and we do not refuse our children. He never paid it back. You never asked him to. I asked once, and he did not speak to us for 6 months, and you said it was not worth fighting over money. That year, I decided I was going to build something that was only yours, not divisible, not inheritable through the shortcuts they were learning to use. Only yours. The way everything we built together was always more yours than it appeared because you worked harder than I did and never complained. I bought this land in October 2009. 80 acres clean, title registered in your name. In your name, Dina, not mine. You will find the deed in the file labeled Deed on the top left shelf. The original is at the county clerk's office in Middlebury. I paid in full with money I had been setting aside over 8 years without putting it in the joint account. Not because I was hiding from you, but because I knew that if it was in the joint account, eventually the kids would find out and some story about a business or a loan would appear. This money was for you, and I did not want anyone to have access to it before the right time. The letter went on. It described Arlo Strack, the caretaker. 35 Holstein cows purchased over 6 years from breeders in Pennsylvania, each with complete veterinary files, each producing an average of 5.5 gallons per day. The contract with Thierry Delba in Lyon, $180,000 annually for the full production paid in cash every July. A bank account in Dina's name with a balance of $52,000. And then the letter said this. On my office wall, you will see photographs I took of you over the years. I took them when you were not looking because you would have hated knowing you were being photographed, and you would have started posing in a way that was not you. I wanted photographs of you being you, in the garden, in the kitchen, in the chair where you sometimes fell asleep in the afternoon. When you thought I would not notice, I always noticed. I always put the blanket. The tears began at the blanket. Not the desperate crying of the days after Boyd's death, which was the crying of a hole of absence of something ripped away. This was a different kind, the kind that rises from inside with a different pressure, the kind that happens when something that has been held tight is finally released, the kind you did not know you needed until you begin and realize you have been holding it for far too long. She cried with the letter in her lap in the old chair that had vanished from the office at home 3 years ago, with the May sun of Vermont coming through the barred windows of a creamery that had been built over 15 years in secret by a man who had spent his entire existence showing love through his hands, through arrangements, through silent gestures that she had noticed but had never been able to fully add up. She was adding them up now. The letter also contained Boyd's prediction about the old creamery. It would fail within 2 years. Vance did not know how to make cheese. She had taught him 3 times and he had never had the patience to learn properly. Without her hand on the butt and her eye on the aging, the quality would collapse. The local buyers would notice. The contracts would be canceled. And there was one more thing. A file in the bottom drawer of the desk labeled Vance Mortgage. Boyd had written, "Vance came to me 2 years ago wanting to use the creamery as collateral for a loan. I said I would think about it and never responded. He did it on his own with a document I never signed, but that has a signature on it that looks like mine. I will not go into detail because that is a matter for lawyers, but the file has everything documented. I kept it because I knew it would be needed someday." When the crying passed, it passed slowly, the way rain spaces out until you realize you are only wet and it is no longer raining. She wiped her face with her apron, folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the larger envelope, opened the smaller envelope she had found inside. A bank card in the name of Nadine Ferris Crandall with an expiration date 3 years away. A printed sheet with online banking credentials and a password. Boyd had written next to the password, "Change this as soon as you can," and a printed account statement from 2 weeks before his death showing an available balance of $52,000. Then she heard footsteps in the creamery entrance. He came through the corridor with his hat in his hand. A man of about 70, perhaps younger, because a life outdoors in the mountains ages the face before it ages the body. Skin the color of the red clay on the road. Long-sleeved plaid shirt, work pants, leather boots, medium build, lean, with the posture of a man who had never developed the shoulder curve that comes from bent-over labor. He stood upright like someone accustomed to looking at distances. He stopped in the doorway of the office when he saw Dina, looked at her for a moment, then removed his hat with his right hand, a gesture of respect that Dina recognized as belonging to a generation that still knew how to make it. "You are Mrs. Crandall." It was not a question. "I am," she said. "Boyd talked about you so much I would know you anywhere." He paused. "My name is Arlo Strack. I have been the caretaker here since the beginning, since 2009. She looked at him for a moment. There was something in his voice, a flat quality without drama. The voice of a man saying exactly what he thinks that made her throat tighten again. 15 years, she said. 15 years, he confirmed. Boyd said there would come a day when I would open this gate for you. He said to treat this place as if it were mine until that day came, and on the day you arrived to treat it as if it were yours. Because it would be." Did he know he was going to die? "I do not think he knew for certain," Arlo said with the care of a man who weighs his words. "But he knew the time would come. He got everything ready about 3 years ago. The letter, the documents, the money in the account. He said, when you got here, I should show you everything properly." There was a good silence, the kind that does not need filling. "The cows," Dina said. 35 head, Arlo said, with a professional pride she recognized immediately. "I can show you the file on everyone if you want. All vaccinated, all producing above average. Had one with a udder issue a while back, but the vet from town sorted it in 2 visits. Is the cheese all right? The cheese is excellent. He said it was simplicity without false modesty. Boyd made better cheese than me. I am not ashamed to say it. But I learned his method, and I follow it exactly. The aging room has 417 wheels now. Thierry in Lyon sends a message every month asking if everything is all right with the production. He is a punctual man. Is there a place for me to stay? Dina asked. Arlo answered as if he had read the thought. Boyd built a small quarters behind the storage building. Not big, but it has a kitchen, a bathroom, a bedroom, and a porch with a view of the pasture. He had it built with care. Said it was for whenever you needed a place while you decided what you wanted to do. Dina turned to him. You were expecting me. I was expecting you. Yes, ma'am. A pause. There is coffee on the stove if you would like some. She looked at this 70-year-old man standing with his hat in his hand who had spent 15 years keeping a secret in a herd for a woman he had never met out of loyalty to a man who had trusted him completely. I would, she said. The quarters were exactly what Arlo had described. Simple, clean built with the right materials in the right places. The porch faced the pasture, a narrow porch with 2 wooden chairs and a low table from which you could see the creek with the birches in the background, and beyond the creek, the hill where the tall grass grew protected from the wind. It was a working view, not a postcard view. The view of someone who would wake up every day and look at this place and think about what needed to be done. Dina sat in one of the chairs with the coffee Arlo had brought in a large blue enamel mug. The mug warmed her hands. The coffee was strong. Coffee made by a man who works early and needs to wake up for real. She thought about her children measuring the walls of the house where she had lived for 32 years. She thought about the appraiser with the tape measure. She thought about the lawyer saying the word vacate in a normal voice. She thought about $52,000 in an account in her name, 417 wheels of cheese with Boyd's handwriting on every tag, a contract with Lion, valid until 2026 and renewable for 3 more years, and 80 acres of land registered under her Social Security number. The sun warmed the porch slightly. One of the cows lowed in the distance, a low, peaceful sound, the sound of an animal that is fine. She was not afraid anymore. But she did not know yet that the hardest part was still ahead. That Vance would not simply accept what had happened, that a piece of paper filed in a courthouse would force her to fight for everything Boyd had built, and that the answer to that fight was already waiting for her in the bottom drawer of Boyd's desk in a file labeled with the name of her eldest son. The first weeks at the farm were the hardest working weeks of Dina Crandall's 68 years, and she had worked hard for every one of them. She did not arrive at the Blue Gate expecting to take possession of anything. She arrived with a small suitcase and a brown envelope and the disposition of a woman who had learned early that labor is the most reliable medicine for nearly everything. What she had found was too large to process at once, so she did what she had always done with things too large to process. She divided them into smaller parts and handled one at a time. Arlo walked her through every foot of the property over the first 2 days. Every fence line, every gate, every building, every animal. He explained. She listened. When she did not understand something, she asked without embarrassment, and he answered with a precision that wasted nothing. On the 3rd morning, she entered the aging room alone and stayed for nearly an hour. She moved along the cedar shelves, slowly lifting wheels to feel their weight, pressing the rind to test its give, bringing her nose close to the natural fissures to catch the interior scent. It was the best aged cheese she had ever held. She had not wanted it to be. There was a part of her that had wanted it to be good, but not extraordinary. Good enough to be honest, not so good that it stung. but it was better than anything she had made in her life. "You overdid it," she said quietly to the empty shelves. It was not a complaint. On the second week, she made her first batch. 12 wheels using the method she knew, the method she had refined over 60 years and taught to Boyd before he ever touched a vat on his own. She set the temperature and the timing from instinct, the way she had done 10,000 times. 7 days later, she opened the aging room for an early check and found the surface covered in the wrong kind of mold. Gray fuzz instead of the natural rind that should have been forming. All 12 wheels were ruined. She stood in the aging room looking at 12 failed wheels of cheese and felt something close to panic for the first time since arriving. Not because of the waste, because of what the failure meant. If she, with 60 years of experience, could not make cheese here, then Boyd had been wrong to trust her. And if Boyd was wrong about that, maybe he was wrong about everything. She walked outside and sat on the Creamery steps. Arlo came by on his way to check the north fence, saw her face, and did not ask what happened. He went inside, made coffee, brought it out, and sat beside her on the steps. They were silent for 5 minutes. Then Arlo said, not looking at her, looking at the pasture, Boyd ruined his first batch too, and his second. The third one came out right. He said the milk here is different, said you have to listen to it first. Dina looked at him. He said that. Those exact words. She stood up, went back inside. This time she changed one variable. She did not explain it to Arlo. She simply adjusted the temperature on the vat controls and extended the coagulation time. It was a small change, the kind that would be invisible to anyone watching, but she could feel the difference in the curd when she cut it. The resistance was different. The moisture was distributed differently. The milk here, fed by altitude pasture and cold mountain springs, had a protein structure she had never worked with before, and it needed a gentler hand than what she was used to giving. 30 days later, she opened the aging room, and the 12 new wheels were perfect. The rind was forming exactly as it should, golden and dry with the hairline cracks that indicate proper moisture loss. Arlo tasted a sliver from the edge of one wheel and said nothing for a moment. You were right, he said. She did not answer. She was looking at the wheel with an expression Arlo had not seen on her face before. It was not satisfaction exactly, it was recognition. She had heard the milk. In the third week, she called Thierry Doba in Lyon. She had been staring at the phone number on the contract for 2 days because calling France was something she had never done in her life. When she dialed, the voice that answered belonged to a middle-aged man whose accent made clear the effort behind his English, a language learned not from school, but from years of tasting and trading cheese with Americans. He said hello, and she said, this is Nadine Crandall, Boyd's wife. There was a pause of 2 seconds. Then he said with an emotion that crossed an ocean through the phone line, Mrs. Crandall, Boyd told me so much about you. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Thierry had learned of Boyd's death because he had called the old Creamery in mid-May. Vance had answered and told him Boyd had passed away and everything was being reorganized. Thierry had been worried about the contract but had decided to wait. The contract was with Crandall Artisan Creamery, and no Crandall had contacted him to cancel. When Dina called, something in his voice lifted. The contract is valid through December 2026, renewable automatically for 3 more years, he said. But for me, the contract is with the quality. With the Crandall method. If you maintain the method, there is nothing to discuss. I taught Boyd the method, she said. A pause, and then Thierry Doba laughed. A short laugh, the laugh of a man who has just understood something he should have understood years ago. So the cheese was never really his, he said. It was yours from the beginning. Dina looked through the window of the quarters at the cows grazing in the late afternoon light. It was both of ours, she said. In October, she found herbs on a shelf in Boyd's office. Dried rosemary, thyme, and a wild herb she recognized as meadow sage, which grew along the edges of the pasture in late summer. She knew what to do with them. She asked Arlo if she could make a separate batch. He told her she did not need to ask. She drove into town the following week to buy proper drying racks and ran into Gemma Nye at the hardware store. Gemma was a retired chemistry teacher who had spent 30 years at the regional high school and who understood fermentation pH levels and bacterial cultures with a precision that most cheesemakers never achieved. They had met years ago at a county fair judging panel, and Gemma had once told Dina that her cheese had a calcium lactate crystal structure she had only seen in European alpine varieties. Now standing in the aisle between rolls of chicken wire and bags of wood screws, Gemma asked what Dina was working on. Dina told her about the herbs. Gemma's eyes narrowed the way they did when a chemical reaction interested her. The oil in meadow sage is volatile above 40 degrees, Gemma said. If you rub it into the rind before the protein matrix has stabilized, the aromatics will dissipate before the paste absorbs them. Wait until the 30-day turn. By then the rind is dense enough to hold the oils in place. Dina looked at her. That is exactly what I was planning to do. Gemma smiled. Then you do not need me. But if you ever want someone to test the pH on your cultures, I have equipment in my garage that is gathering dust. Dina thanked her and filed the offer away in the part of her mind reserved for people who might matter later. A cheesemaker who also has a chemist on call is a cheesemaker who makes fewer mistakes. 42 wheels, a variation that involved lightly rubbing the herbs into the surface of the rind at the 30-day turn, creating an aromatic layer that would slowly penetrate the paste over the remaining aging period. She had experimented with this years ago at the old Creamery, and Boyd had found it interesting but had not adopted it for the main production because it changed the flavor profile that Thierry had been buying. She sent 3 wheels to Lyon by refrigerated shipping with a short note. Thierry, Boyd did not make this in his lifetime. This is me now. Tell me what you think. The response came in 5 days. Mrs. Crandall, this is extraordinary. Can I include it in the 2027 contract as an additional line? I suggest premium pricing 40% above standard. Sending formal proposal. She printed the email, folded it, put it in her apron pocket beside the wedding photograph. The following week, she drove to Burlington with 4 wheels of the herb cheese and walked into the shop of Perry Driscoll, a man of 55, who owned the most respected artisan cheese store in northern Vermont. Boyd had sold to Perry years ago before the French contract began, and Perry considered himself a guardian of Vermont's cheese-making tradition. He was proud, particular, and accustomed to being the one who decided what was good enough for his shelves. She set the cheese on his counter without introduction. Perry recognized the name Crandall on the label. He cut a thin slice, placed it on his tongue, and closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them and looked at her. Boyd's cheese died with Boyd, Mrs. Crandall. I do not do charity placements. Dina did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She picked up the cheese, placed a handwritten card with her phone number on the counter, and said, when you change your mind, call me. Then she walked out. 3 weeks later, after word of the Lyon contract renewal reached Vermont, through the small and efficient network of artisan food distributors Perry Driscoll called. Dinah let the phone ring 5 times before she answered. I was wrong, he said. I know, she said. Can we talk about distribution? Come to the farm. Bring your own mug. In November, Dina drove to the nursing home in Montpelier to visit Opal Crandall. Boyd's mother was 92. Her body had thinned to almost nothing but her eyes, which were exactly Boyd's eyes, the same shape, the same way of looking at a person as if reading something written very small, were fully alert. Dina had come out of duty. She had always visited Opal every few months, and she was not going to let Boyd's death break that rhythm. She sat beside the bed and held the old woman's hand and told her about the farm, about the gate, about the letter. She told it simply, without drama, the way she told everything. Opal listened without interrupting. Then she squeezed Dina's hand with a strength that surprised both of them and said, "He told me about the farm, about the gate." Dina went still. "He called me once a month for 15 years, Opal said. Always talked about the same person." "You knew," Dina said. "I knew," Opal said. "He told me when I am gone, Dina is going to need someone who believes I was not crazy." She paused and something shifted in her face, a caution entering her expression. "He also said one more thing. He said if the boys came after you, you should look in the bottom drawer of the desk. A file labeled Vance Mortgage. He said you would know what to do with it." Dina looked at her mother-in-law for a long time. Opal said, "I do not know what is in it." But Boyd was never the kind of man who kept things without a reason. The drive back from Montpellier took 2 hours. Dina spent most of it in silence, the radio off the road, unwinding through the mountains in the late autumn light. She thought about Boyd calling his mother every month for 15 years, always talking about the same person. She thought about the kind of love that builds a farm in secret and calls its own mother once a month to make sure there is a witness. She thought about the bottom drawer. She did not open it that night. She opened it the following morning after coffee, after checking the cows, after the day had started in the way days are supposed to start. The file was there exactly where Boyd said it would be. Inside was a photocopy of a loan document using the old Creamery as collateral, made out in Boyd's name, bearing a signature that looked like Boyd's. Dina had seen Boyd's signature on 40 years of documents, tax returns, purchase orders, birthday cards. She knew every stroke. The final downstroke of the H in the last name always pulled downward, a small habitual flourish. This signature pulled upward. It was a forgery, not a sophisticated one, but good enough to fool a loan officer who had never met Boyd. Boyd had kept the evidence and had never confronted his son. Dina sat with the file open on the desk for a long time. She understood what she was holding. This was a weapon that could end everything. Forgery was a criminal offense. She could send this to the court. She could send it to the police. She could destroy Vance. She did not want to destroy Vance. Vance was her son. He was the baby she had baked cookies for at 2 a.m. He was the boy who had spent 20 days in the hospital with pneumonia while she sat beside his bed without leaving. She hated what he was doing, but she did not hate him. She was his mother, and she would be his mother until the last breath she took. And being a mother meant holding both things at once, the hatred of the action and the love of the person. She closed the file, put it back in the drawer, and waited. In early December, a silver Pathfinder appeared on the dirt road and parked outside the blue gate. Vance got out of the driver's side. Jolene got out of the passenger side. They stood together for a moment, looking at the gate with the expression of people who are seeing something they had not expected to find. Dina was on the porch when they walked through. She did not stand up. She watched them cross the garden path past the Creamery building and stop at the bottom of the porch steps. Vance's eyes moved across the property with the same appraising quality he had applied to the house in Middlebury. Jolene looked at the cows in the pasture with an expression that was closer to confusion than greed. "This is what he was doing," Vance said. Not a question, a statement delivered with the tone of a man revising his opinion of someone who had always seemed predictable. "This is what he was doing," Dina confirmed. "How much is it worth?" Jolene asked. The question arrived with the bluntness of someone who has spent 2 decades leading with money. "It is not for sale," Dina said. Vance put one foot on the bottom step. "Mom, this land was purchased during the marriage. That makes it a marital asset. The will distributed the estate to us. This should have been included. Dina looked at her eldest son with a calm that had taken 68 years to build. The land is in my name, she said, purchased with funds that predated the marriage. There is documentation for everything. Boyd made sure of that. Vance's jaw tightened. We will have a lawyer look at this. You already have a lawyer, Dina said. You brought one to my kitchen 10 days after your father was buried. You are welcome to bring him here too. The paperwork will say the same thing regardless of who reads it. Jolene shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Mom, we are not trying to fight you. We just want what is fair. Something moved in Dina's expression that neither of her children had seen before. Not anger exactly. Closer to a patient exhaustion with a conversation she had been having for 30 years without ever being heard. Fair, she repeated. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. You measured my house with a tape measure. You brought a stranger to appraise the rooms where I raised you. You told me to vacate, and now you stand on the porch of a place your father spent 15 years building for me, and you tell me you want what is fair. Neither Vance nor Jolene spoke. I will tell you what is fair. This land stays mine, the creamery stays mine, the cows stay mine. You have the house, the old creamery, the truck, and the bank accounts. That is what your father decided. If you do not like it, you can take it up with him, but he is not available for that conversation anymore. Vance stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned without a word and walked back toward the gate. Jolene lingered for a few seconds, opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it and followed her brother. Dina sat on the porch until the sound of the Pathfinder's engine faded completely into the distance. Then she went inside and made coffee because it was past 4 in the afternoon, and she had cows to check before dark. She did not have to wait long after that visit. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from the county courthouse. Vance, through Leland Trask, had filed a formal petition requesting the court to review the ownership of the Old Falls Road property on the grounds that it had been acquired with marital funds during the marriage, and that its registration in Dina's name constituted concealment of marital assets from the estate. A preliminary hearing was scheduled in 60 days. Dina read the letter standing on the porch. Her hands did not tremble. But inside, for the first time since arriving at the farm, she felt the ground shift beneath her. If the court agreed with Vance, she could lose everything. Everything Boyd had spent 15 years building. She called Boyd's attorney in Middlebury, the one who had drafted the will. He confirmed what she already knew. The documentation was clean. The money came from a personal account Boyd had opened with funds predating the marriage supported by clear records. You are on very solid legal ground, he said, but courts are unpredictable. Dina did not file a counter-motion. She did not hire a second lawyer. She called Vance. She told him to come to the farm, alone, no lawyers. He came on a Thursday afternoon, driving the silver Pathfinder down the dirt road and parking outside the blue gate the way he had parked before. But this time he was alone, and he walked through the gate with a posture Dina had not seen on him since he was a teenager. The posture of someone who knows he is walking into something but does not know what. She sat him down at the kitchen table in the quarters, did not offer coffee this time. She placed the file on the table in front of him, said nothing, waited for him to open it, read it, and understand. Vance opened the file. He read the first page. His eyes moved to the signature at the bottom. His face changed. It was a transformation that took about 30 seconds, moving from defensive alertness to recognition to something Dina had not seen on her eldest son's face in years: fear. He looked up at her. Dina spoke in a normal voice, steady, without heat. Withdraw the petition. I will not use this, but do not make me reconsider. A silence filled the kitchen that was different from any silence that had ever existed between them. It was the silence of a son realizing that his mother has always seen him clearly, has always known exactly what he is and has chosen every single time to love him anyway. Mom, he said. His voice was smaller than she had ever heard it. I am sorry. It was not clear what he was apologizing for. The forged signature, the petition, the 30-day eviction, the appraiser with the tape measure, the word vacate, all of it. Maybe more than all of it. Maybe he was apologizing for the evening in the kitchen 20 years ago when he had said to his sister, thinking his mother could not hear, all they have ever known is cheese. Dina did not respond. She nodded once. That was enough. Vance withdrew the petition the following week. Leland Trask sent a formal notice of dismissal to the court. The case was closed. The news about the old creamery came through Lucille Fenton, the 73-year-old widow who lived 2 miles from the Blue Gate and who had become Dina's most frequent visitor. Lou had lost her own husband to cancer 8 years earlier and had rebuilt her life around her garden, her preserves, and a habit of dropping in on neighbors with food and information in roughly equal measure. She never knocked. She simply appeared on the porch with whatever she had brought and began talking as if the conversation had already been in progress. Lou appeared one February morning with a jar of fig preserves and the casual delivery of a woman reporting the weather. They lost the contract with the Burlington distributor, Lou said. A batch went bad. The store would not buy the next shipment. Then the boy tried to sell wholesale to a dairy processor, but processors pay a fraction of retail. And the house, Dina asked. The renovation never started. Something about a problem with the financing. Lou took a sip from her mug. Life has got a way, she said. Dina thought about that phrase for a long time after Lou left. She did not feel joy. There was no joy in her children's difficulty. She was enough of a mother to know she would never stop being a mother, regardless of anything. What she felt was closer to confirmation. The way it feels when you check your arithmetic and the final number is exactly what you calculated, no rounding, no margin of error. Boyd had calculated correctly. In late October, while reorganizing the office, completely pulling every document from every shelf to verify and refile in a system that made sense to her, Dina found the last letter. It was in the bottom of the desk drawer beneath the file she had already used inside an unmarked envelope. Not regular paper, stationery, the kind of heavy paper you buy at a proper store for writing things that matter. Boyd's handwriting was more unsteady here than in any of the other letters. The lines wavered. The pen had shaken in places. This was the handwriting of a man who was sick and who knew it, writing what he understood would be the last thing he would ever put on paper. Dina, one last thing I forgot to put in the big letter. Or maybe I did not forget. Maybe I saved it for a smaller letter because it felt too large for my handwriting. In 2014, the drought nearly killed the herd. 3 cows died. 11 stopped producing. Arlo said we should sell some off and cut our losses. I stood in the middle of a pasture that had gone yellow and dead at 4 in the morning, and I thought, what am I doing? 5 years of building and nature can erase it all in one summer. I nearly quit, nearly sold everything. Then I thought about you. I thought about 1979 when you lost the nursing program because Vance got pneumonia. You did not quit. You did not complain. You did not revisit the subject. You just folded the envelope, put it away, and kept going. I thought if Dina did not quit that year, then I do not quit this year. When we bought the first cow in 2010, a young Holstein that cost more than I had any right to spend, I made cheese from her milk alone for the first time here without you. And when I opened the aging room 30 days later and smelled that cheese, what I thought was not, it is good or it worked. What I thought was Dina would know what is different about this before I finished talking. It was always like that. For 40 years, everything important I did, the measure was the same. What would Dina think? I hope you are enjoying the cheese, old girl. Boyd. Dina sat with the letter. Her hand found the apron pocket one last time, found the wooden beads moved across them slowly. Not the automatic motion of habit, a deliberate motion, a completion. She did not cry this time. She sat with the presence of Boyd, not the absence. Not the sharp daily pain that had filled the first months, but the gentler form that remains when the missing finally stops hurting every hour and becomes instead a kind of company. He was here in the office he had built, in the shelves he had installed, in the chair he had taken from their house, so that when she arrived, she would have something familiar to sit in the cedar and the rennet and the 417 wheels that carried his name in his own handwriting. She refolded the letter and placed it with the others in the top drawer of the desk, where she would be able to reach it whenever she wanted. December came with rain. Thierry confirmed that the July shipment had arrived in perfect condition, that the restaurants in Lyon and Paris that bought Crandall cheese were extremely satisfied, and that the herb line had created a waiting list longer than the available supply. He sent the formal proposal for the additional line at 42% above the standard price with a 2-year contract. If Dinah maintained the current production pace, the combined annual value of both lines would reach approximately $250,000. She called Arlo to the porch, placed the printed proposal on the table between them, and said, "If I accept this, I will need more people in production, and I will need to expand the aging room." Arlo looked at the proposal, then at the pasture, then at her. "I have a niece in town who has been making cheese with her mother since she was small. She is out of work right now, and the mason who built the original aging room still lives in the area. Call them both," Dina said. On the last morning of the year, Dina woke at 4:30 to the sound of light rain on the roof. The summer rain of Vermont, warm and steady, carrying the smell of wet grass and warm earth. She lay in bed listening for a moment. Then she got up, made coffee, put on her apron, pulled on the rubber boots, and went to check the cows in the dark with a flashlight. All 35, all healthy. The youngest of the herd, a 3-month-old Holstein calf daughter of one of the best producers, the one Arlo had called the baby, and whose name Dina had kept, stood looking at her with the large wet eyes of a curious young animal, lifting her muzzle toward the beam of the flashlight. "Happy New Year," Dina said to the calf. The calf made a low sound in return. Back in the quarters, with the sky still dark and the rain still falling gently, she heated the coffee and went out to the porch with the blue enamel mug. The rain made a rhythm on the concrete floor of the porch, a music that was not trying to be music, just the sound of water meeting surface. The pasture was dark, but she knew it was green, knew it was alive, knew it was soaked with good water that would climb through the grass and pass through the milk and arrive in the cheese that Thierry Doba would place on a restaurant table in Lyon in July. 68 years old, 40 years working beside a man who had built this place in silence and put her name on it. She had arrived here with a small suitcase and a brown envelope, and more fear than she had admitted to herself. She had found cows and cheese in the old chair and photographs on the wall, and a letter that began with Dina and ended with old girl, and that had explained not with beautiful words, but with 80 acres registered under her name, what they had been to each other for 4 decades. The estate her children had received with contempt. The creamery they said would be easy to run. The house they had measured with tape measures while she sat on the porch was generating more than $250,000 a year from behind a blue gate they never knew existed. The land was worth 4 times the entire rest of the inheritance. And she was here 68 years old with hot coffee and summer rain and a creamery that had a waiting list in Lyon and a distribution deal in Burlington and a mason coming next week to start the expansion. Boyd had been trying to say it for 15 years. Through every monthly absence, every locked office door, every quiet return with a different smell on his clothes. He had been saying it the only way he knew how. Not with speeches, not with declarations, with his hands, with cedar shelves and treated fence posts, and a brass plaque that said Crandall Artisan Creamery, established 2009. With a farm that was a sentence 40 years long, written in pasture and milk and patience, and it said you were the best thing that happened in my life. It is not a phrase. It is the result of 40 years of observation. It is never too late. Never too late to do the right thing. Never too late to build something that is worth building. Never too late to say, in the only language your hands know, what your heart has felt every day for 40 years, but your mouth could never find the shape for. The rain eased with the dawn. The pasture appeared gradually in the gray light of a cloudy morning, dark green and shining. The cows began to move. Milking time was approaching, and they knew it the way animals know the rhythms that govern their days, not by clocks, but by light and habit, and the deep certainty of creatures who trust that the world will continue to provide. Dina drank the last of her coffee, set the mug down on the small table, and stood up. She had cheese to make,